No, but they asked me about Alan Cobb because he lives in Topeka, and I was saying the Constitution just says inhabitant of the state, not resident of the district. I know. Yeah. Sometimes those rumors just get started.
Well, look at your seat. You're sort of right in the middle.
Because no one, he or anyone associated with him has asked us for the list of the 126
There you go.
committee members. That's
There
actually
you
a
go.
sign they're interested.
Excellent. Wow, you brought a lot of stuff. This is what I brought.
Yeah, wait a look at the list and not much to sell there.
Not.
I'm just going to wing it.
I got a pen out just in case I was going to make notes.
He is in for sure. Cobb is very serious about it because he is a Wichita guy.
I always wing it.
T-Hart's making
Do you have
phone
my
calls
election return?
to people. Mark Carr's looked at it, decided not to run. Ty Masterson, Weigel.
Oh.
I don't know.
Okay.
He hasn't talked to us. And then I've got about 10 phone calls from people I don't even know saying I'm interested, and
They
I'll
prefer
email
that.
the list and we'll go from there.
Hi, Bob. Good to see you.
When is the election going to be? Does he have to be?
You have to have an official vacancy, which means Pompeo submits his letter of resignation until January.
I'm going to be interested in hearing what your take on this
45 to 60 days.
election
And
was.
he's got a little project he's working on.
And
Well, you got to.
Middle of March to early April, somewhere in that time frame, I'd assume.
Well, I'm glad I could be a All right. Well,
Test 1 2 3 1 2 3 4.
He wants to add to it, so we've been talking about it. He's trying to get money out of my boss.
sneak away. Right.
I could.
the lights right, but not.
But, yeah, I don't know what it is that's going to pull me away from being
Hello?
So I could,
Hello?
I could be retired.
Are we doing testing?
Something I want to do badly. Exactly.
You don't get to say anything.
I don't have to go out and find something right now, which is nice.
Test.
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 Good evening.
Test. Test.
Test.
Test. Hello. We passed the test, apparently.
Just make sure that if you don't have your own mic, if you're sharing a mic, that you get it over in front of you when you're jump into the discussion.
Thursday, Wednesday afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Uh-oh, his one, it doesn't work.
Now he has the mic.
The microphone on. There we go. Hey, success. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Lacey, the director of the Dole Institute. I want to welcome everyone to our Kansas Post-Election Conference. We have a fantastic panel assembled for you this afternoon, and I'm going to get off here very quickly and leave it to them, but I want to make three very brief announcements. One, I believe everybody would have picked up one of these flyers or a program for today. On the back, you can find a list for our post-election conference, which will be our national post-election conference, which will focus on the presidential campaign next week, Thursday and Friday. It starts Thursday at 2:30 with a discussion of the Democratic nomination fight, followed at 4:30 by a discussion of the Republican fight. Those times are on our website if you want to double check them. And then we start at 9 a.m. on Friday morning, and we do a few hours discussion of the general election. You see the list of the experts that we have coming in. We have representatives from quite a few of the campaigns on both sides of the aisle. We have quite a few prominent journalists and others who will be part of this, and so we would encourage you to come back next Thursday and Friday and be part of that. Today's discussion will focus on Kansas, so I would just encourage everybody, if you have questions about the presidential campaign, unless they are directly related to Kansas and the outcome of other elections in Kansas, please hold those till next week. We would appreciate it. Secondly, I want to remind everyone that at the Dole Institute, we emphasize the importance of treating people civilly and with respect. You will hear some things, I'm sure, today that you disagree with, some things you may disagree strongly with. We ask that you keep your disagreement quiet and respectful. And if you want to, you'll get a chance to ask questions at the end. You can ask a respectful but very tough question at the end if you would like to. So we appreciate your honoring that. The final thing I want to do is thank our panelists and thank Professor Burdett Loomis for taking a big role in organizing this discussion. But also I wanted to introduce our moderator, who will introduce the individual members of our panel. Dave Helling works for the Kansas City Star. He served as a fellow here 2 years ago, leading a study group on the midterm elections. He's a great friend of the Dole Institute and is the perfect person to moderate today's discussion. And as I said, he'll introduce your panelists. Please welcome Dave Helling.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Great to see some old friends here, and great to be back at the Dole Institute to talk about the results of the elections in Kansas this year. I apologize, I've got a little bit of a cold, so if I have to clear my throat occasionally, I ask your indulgence. Before we introduce the panel, I would say, or echo what Bill just talked about, which is this is a great panel of people to talk about what just happened in Kansas. And the fact that they're here is in no small measure a tribute to what Bill does down here at the Institute. And Bill Lacey has become an important figure in Kansas politics. So he deserves a round of applause before we get started here. Okay, we're going to talk about 2016 Kansas politics today for about an hour, and then we'll take some questions and your own observations. And we've got a great mix of people involved in politics, political scientists, reporters, and others, opinion people who can talk about A, what happened, and B, what it might mean for the 2017 session. Rather than me introducing them, why don't we just start on the end, and John, we'll start with you, my good friend John Hanna, and then we'll go down and everybody introduce yourself, where you're from, and then we'll start the discussion.
Well, I'm John Hanna. I'm the Topeka correspondent for the Associated Press. Been covering the State House now for about 30 years, I think.
Far too long.
Yeah. I'm happy to say, a former student of Burdett Loomis's. I don't know how he feels about that. I have a daughter who's about to graduate from college. Very proud of her. She's going to school up outside Chicago. So I'll put in a plug for her. And I'm really pleased that you all have invited me to be here.
Hi, I'm Burdett Loomis. I've been here since 1979, so I did have John as a student and didn't harm him too much. I've known two AP heads in Topeka, Lou Ferguson and John, and both have been, in very different ways, exemplary in terms of working really hard to inform all Kansans of the politics that go on in this state. I'm a professor of political science at KU.
I'm Joan Wagnon. I'm from Topeka. I've been involved in Kansas politics for about 30 years, serving as a former legislator, Secretary of Revenue, and currently the treasurer of the Kansas Democratic Party.
I'm Patrick Miller. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at KU. I study elections, public opinion, political psychology, and quantitative methods. I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia. I've lived in Kansas for now. This is starting been at KU for 3 years. So from Virginia by way of North Carolina and Georgia. But I am Burdett's colleague and happy to be here today.
I am Jeff King, the current vice president of the Kansas Senate. I represent a district that encompasses 3 counties in southeast Kansas.
Ann?
I'm Ann Gardner. I'm the former editorial page editor at the Journal World. I worked at the Journal World for about 40 years, and amazingly, I still have opinions. So.
That's good.
I'm Jason Probst. I'm the opinion page editor for the Hutchinson News. I've been there about 14 years, and I'm glad to be here.
I'm Bob Beatty. I'm a political science professor at Washburn University, also the political analyst for KSNT News, and I write a column for the Topeka Capital Journal. But also we're involved, want to let you know about a project. We're collecting the political TV ads of hopefully every single candidate in Kansas history. We have over 1,000 of them. So if you go to kspolitics.org and you want to have a fun evening, just click on the Kansas political TV ads and you'll have a great time. I'm just plugging that. Thanks.
I'm Annie Kuether. I'm state representative from Central Topeka. I am starting my 22nd year in the House of Representatives. I started when I was 2. I'm proud mother of 2 and 3 grandchildren, and I am looking forward to what will be new and exciting in this session. It's going to be hard, but it's going to be a challenge, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Clay Barker. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas Republican Party. I've been doing that since 2011. I got into politics in 2010 as a volunteer. Glad to be here. I have 2 daughters that are KU grads. My wife and I are KU grads, and my father-in-law was a professor here. He just retired.
Okay, great. All right, again, panelists, thanks for being here. And a reminder before we get started that if you have anything you want to add to the discussion, don't wait for me to call on you. Just raise your hand or get my attention, and you can certainly jump in. I want to start with Dr. Miller, because I think we need to start, don't we, with a bit of just a quantitative analysis. The general consensus, the general understanding is that the Kansas legislature of 2017 is not going to resemble the Kansas legislature of 2016. Is that right? What happened in August and November?
Well, in August, you had moderates pick up a number of seats, about 13 in the state house, 8 in the state senate. And I always have to qualify like what moderate means in Kansas, because it is not the same thing. So Republican moderates really span the spectrum from Republicans who are pretty certifiably liberal to ones who are maybe Bob Dole, Ronald Reagan type center-right Republicans. And conservatives, quote unquote, whatever that means as well, different camps as well. Some of them tend to be more libertarian, more Christian conservative, more Tea Party, different flavors. But moderates, whatever that means, picked up 13 in the House, 8 in the Senate, and then Democrats gained a net, who are not all homogenous themselves either, gained a net of 1 in the Senate and 12 in the House. So some substantial changes between the different factions.
The understanding we sort of commonly have, Patrick, is that it's a third conservative, a third moderate, a third Democrat. Is that in the legislature as a whole? Is that a rough thing for us to understand?
In the legislature as a whole, I'm math in my head. In the Senate, there's about 19 or 20 conservatives.
Out of how many?
Out of 40.
All right.
Depending upon how you count.
So about
conservative.
50-50.
Right. And then between 9 Democrats and then, again, what's a moderate, 10 to 12 moderate Republicans there. In the House, it is about a third. Again, what's a moderate, what's a conservative? How many people have voted more conservatively because that's where the power's been and might gravitate back to the center now? There's probably about 40 to 45 each moderates, conservatives, and then 40 Democrats.
Yep. John Hanna, do you see it the same way? What's your head count show?
Oh, I take it, Patrick's warning about putting people into buckets, because I think some of it depends on the issue. For example, on abortion, I think the legislature's probably going to still remain pretty conservatively anti-abortion. But I would say those numbers don't sound out of line. The Democrats and the moderate Republicans have some hopes of forming coalitions. Of course, the moderates may also form coalitions on other issues with more conservative Republicans. One of the interesting things to watch is going to be the leadership elections that are going to be coming up next week. Particularly in the House, there's going to be a new House Speaker because Ray Merrick didn't run for re-election, and he was more on the conservative end, obviously, and you have 2 identified conservatives running, Ron Reichman and Gene Vickery, who's the majority leader, and Reichman is the House Appropriations Chairman, and then Russ Jennings from Lakin out west is kind of the perceived moderate candidate. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out. if I had to guess, I would still probably, looking at the numbers, give the edge in terms of the internal dynamics, who controls the caucus, a little bit to the conservatives. And then the issue is the moderates become kind of the swing votes on the budget and taxes and stuff like that.
We'll want to get to what's going to happen here in a few minutes, but again, just establishing a baseline. Bob Beatty, I'll go to you. One thing we do know is that the governor is the same in 2017 as the governor in 2016, and I think one of the things we were told back in August and certainly in the general election is that in some ways Sam Brownback was on the ballot this time, even though he didn't face the voters. Is that right? Was this a referendum in your view on Governor Brownback, or was it more a referendum on individual races, the quality of candidates, the amount of money raised, that type of thing?
Well, I'll be a political scientist and say both.
Yeah.
But,
or a college professor.
To get that baseline, to give my credit to my colleague at Washburn, Mark Peterson, he took Women for Kansas scores of legislators, and an A would be moderate. So he took every legislator that got a C or above, and in terms of this number. So in the Senate, 2040, like we mentioned. In the House, 70 possible moderates, or at least around that area, out of 125. So that's 56%. And of course, the issues can vary. So it is a big change. Governor Brownback's approval ratings over 10 polls are 22%. And you can look at that two ways. One, you can just absolutely be shocked that the legislature is not completely democratic, but we're all Kansans, so we know that's not going to happen. I wrote a column where I went in 2010 where Mark Parkinson had a 45% approval, or a -1 total, and Amanda Atkins, the then chair of the Republican Party, said this is startling, and it's clear Kansans don't support his agenda. Brownback's at 22% approval with a -44 difference between approval and disapproval. It's what we saw happen was Susan Wagle and a number of Republicans clearly look at, smartly, politically look at what's going on and say, we've got to disassociate ourselves from the governor. Keep in mind, folks, this is the worst approval rating of any governor in the nation, and we've got two governors, one in Maine and one in Alabama, who are embroiled in ridiculous scandals. So this is a scandal-free governor at 22%. So Susan Wagle in the Senate and a number of other politicians smartly held a press conference and said, we're going to fix these problems, and we don't know what the governor's doing. And even in today's Capital Journal, she said, well, we're not going to go along with, if he's doing this, that, and the other. So we've got moderates, we've got conservatives, we've got Democrats, and then we've got House and Senate members who are anti-Brownback, and that's another bucket. I mean, you could have conservative Republicans who are against the governor. So that was a long-winded answer to say this is really complicated on the governor question.
Right, and I guess, and Clay, let me go to you quickly, and then we'll hear from some women on this panel eventually. Do you think, in retrospect, Governor Brownback, was he the issue in these races, or is it more complicated than that? I mean, I'm trying to get back to what happened, not what will happen, and whether or not people were in essence running against the governor, or whether there were other things at play.
He was definitely a factor, and there'd be some voters that were just generally anti-Brownback, and there were others that their main motivation was they didn't like the status quo. It didn't matter who it was. They just had this uncomfortable feeling about where Kansas was. You couldn't really convince them with facts one way or the other. They just had their framework there. Now, as far as, for instance, mail, the state party pays for all the mail. That's why it always says paid for by the party. If candidates wanted to put on their mail, I opposed Governor Brownback on this issue. We had no problem with that, and he didn't either. We asked him, and whatever it took to win. So if people wanted to oppose him on particular issues, it's whatever plays with the voters.
Ann, did you see that? I mean, do you think this was a referendum? I mean, I'm trying to get in. We've clearly identified there's been a turnover. Why did we get a turnover in here?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm Annie.
Annie. Well, I was going to this Ann, but that's
Oh,
okay.
sorry,
You go
Ann.
ahead.
Oh,
Go ahead. No,
okay.
no. You go first,
I
Annie.
couldn't tell. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Annie, you go first, and then we'll come back.
I just was going to add that I think it made a great deal of difference between the House races and the Senate races, because the makeup of these districts are so different. A House seat is pretty concise, and you really have a good opportunity to get to know your legislator if they're doing their job. The senators have a huge amount of area to cover, and such a diverse group of people because of the enormity of the amount of people they represent. I think that makes a difference, and I think maybe in Kansas at the top of the ticket, even we're not supposed to talk national stuff, but I think that made a difference in a lot of the races, in bigger races, not necessarily the House races.
Right. What did you see, Ann? Did you see this?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with Clay that I think that there was a fair amount of the influence of people who are just generally unhappy with the way things are going. And in general, it's interesting to me that in general people never think that their own representative or their own senator is the one that's causing the problem, but obviously in this case, at least in the primaries when they were pitting two Republicans against each other, they made some real choices there about whether they were happy with the job that was being done. Now, to the extent that they tied that to the governor, it's a little bit unclear. I think that it will maybe become more clear during the legislative session.
Yes, Jeff, let me ask you that question. Do you think that voters made their decision based on the governor's 6 years, or was there something else at work?
I think it was a combination of obvious dissatisfaction with the governor, as we've seen in his approval ratings, but also just a general malaise about the status quo. One thing that to me was interesting is that the individual senator or representative's position on the governor's agenda seemed to have absolutely no impact on how the voters perceived them. We saw numbers of some of the more moderate members of the Senate, Vicki Schmidt or Carolyn McGinn, run extremely close races and primaries where, over the last 4 years, I'm not sure many aspects of the governor's agenda that they supported at all.
Why do you think it was so close, Jeff? I mean, what was it, because people just automatically attached incumbents with the governor, or because there was just an anti-incumbency that had nothing to do with Sam Brownback? I mean, that could have played a role as well.
I think yes and yes.
Yeah.
I think there is very little differentiation by the voters on the positions that individual members of the legislature take, at least in this election cycle. And I don't think there was
You don't
as
think
much
people said, well, she voted yes, she voted no, that they made their decisions on that basis?
Well, I'll give you an example in the Senate. Jim Denning was consistently one of the, if not the loudest advocate against the LLC loophole that the governor proposed, which voters showed overwhelmingly, and polls showed overwhelmingly, Kansans didn't approve of. His poll numbers weren't any better than anyone else's, and quite frankly, they were a little worse. And so I don't think there was that sort of nuanced, well, my representative or senator is anti-Brownback Republican, this one's a pro-Brownback Republican, we're going to treat them differently.
But okay, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to say that may be true in some cases, but there were other cases, and I wanted to bring Jason into this discussion since this is his neck of the woods. When we talked to voters on primary day in Hutchinson, they repeatedly told us we're voting against the majority leader, the Senate majority leader, Terry Bruce, because he doesn't represent us, he's too close to the governor, all of that. It wasn't any, you didn't get specifics necessarily, but you did just get this general sense that they thought he was a little too close. And of course, the new senator, Ed Berger, who's a Republican, very clearly in the primary broke with the governor. But talk
about that, Jason. And also, what did Senator Bruce do in the face of this dynamic when it became clear to him that maybe he was in trouble?
Well, it seemed he went to Kansas City to lobby to be Senate president, and that hurt him. Bruce has a different dynamic because he seemed to be disengaged from his district quite a bit. And the feeling is that he was more interested in his political career and his alignment with Brownback than actually serving the residents of the 34th district. I think in my area, down central Kansas, there was a real strong anti-Brownback feeling. And
What was that based on, Jason? What, I mean, was it the school, the finance problem? Was it the LLC exemption? Was it the credit? I mean, what,
It was
there
all
any,
that. It was
there
all
wasn't
that.
any specific thing?
Medicaid expansion was a big issue.
In Hutchinson?
In Hutchinson, the hospital administrators were very good about getting the message out on that, and very specific about what that would mean for our community. And you had some of that down in your district, too. So,
Yeah. He was quoted once or twice on that issue, as I recall.
but I think what people wanted, or what I saw that people wanted, was not just anti-Brownback, but people who would stand up to Brownback. Like, there was a feeling that there was Brownback, there was a very compliant legislature who, and we know this too, the race for the speaker is going to be a big thing, because if you talk to some of the more moderate lawmakers, Merrick wouldn't even allow his chairs to bring up some legislation like Medicaid expansion. Said, we're not going to hear this. The hope along the moderates is that if we can get different leadership in, we may actually have some hearings on some of these. So there was really a feeling in our area that if you, not just anti-Brownback, but do you have the nerve to tell Brownback, like the LLC loophole, I think a lot of people say, just let the governor veto it, put it all on him. But the legislature had no will to do that, it seemed, and they wanted someone to do that.
And that's, to me, the most interesting dynamic of all is, in the face of what was happening, how did Republicans react? And how did candidates react? You know, what, did they distance themselves from the governor? Did they embrace the governor? Because it seems like a very difficult call in the middle of a, Joan, let's go to you. I know you're a Democrat, but you've run for office. What goes through a candidate's mind when he or she understands that votes, connections, and stuff are going to be more problematic than maybe they anticipated?
Well, they try, if you're an incumbent, you try to insulate yourself and make sure you don't make the wrong votes.
And did we see that this year, do you think?
I
or-
think people were voting out of loyalty, they were voting out of conviction on a particular issue, and the things that they passed have created terrible problems for the state of Kansas. And the public got tired of seeing all of the bad headlines. You know, we're running out of money, we're having problems with our schools, and candidates then embraced that message and took it to the election. I looked at candidate literature, just like Clay did, because it comes through the party and it says, you know, paid for by the Kansas Democratic Party. And our 13 pickups, with perhaps exception of one, ran very successfully on tying that incumbent to Brownback.
Yeah.
And tying it to his policies, tying it to the, quote, mess we're in at the state.
But Clay, it seems like help us understand what a difficult challenge that is for incumbents. I mean, you're kind of in for a dime, in for a dollar. If you try to separate yourself from the mess, then people say, well, you know, I'd prefer that someone else, an outsider, come in. I mean, it must have been a very difficult environment for people who had supported the governor for, 2, 4, 6 years.
Yeah, it was a difficult environment, and there were a lot of variations in northeast Johnson County, and I lived in Johnson County. The Republicans tend to be very liberal, and they were being attacked for being Brownback supporters and Trump supporters, and it really got to them. And we were joking, they were trying to outflank their Democratic opponent to the left by bragging how anti-Brownback they had been. And others realized, incumbents, that they had an issue, and they were trying to make the election less about votes and more about the people. It's Mary versus John instead of Republican versus Democrat.
Was it mostly about the past, do you think, or was it about the future? I mean, we're always told that voters are more focused on the future than what happened. Didn't seem like that in Kansas this year, though.
It's voters will have a world view, or they'll frame the issues in the election, and at a certain point, facts no longer really matter to them that much. They're pretty sure they know how they think the state's going, and they're just going to base their vote off that. And then for the candidates and the parties, it becomes more a matter, instead of persuasion, of turnout. Find the people that'll support your guy.
Particularly
and get them to
in the
vote.
primary, right?
Well, I don't get involved in the primaries, but
Right,
in general, that was.
But I mean, I'm asking you to sort of observe as what the candidates are thinking. They need to motivate people in the primary, particularly.
Right, find their
Yeah.
supporters and get them to vote.
Yeah, and Bird, let's just be clear, and we'll get to you and Jeff, but Bird, we're talking about the world turned upside down in a little bit, aren't we? I mean, the idea that this election was in essence determined by the popularity or of the governor, the Republican governor in a Republican state, maybe some of the incumbents never saw this coming. Is that possible that a year ago they thought, well, I'm an incumbent. Incumbents always get reelected in Kansas?
I don't see how they couldn't have seen it. As Bob pointed out, the polling data were so clear, and as Clay pointed, the headlines were clear time and time again. I think particularly in the Republican primaries, there's no party label, so you have to link on to something, and the Brownback effect is substantial there. What's interesting is the Democrats in the House seem to be effective, and whereas the Democrats in the Senate couldn't quite get over that hump. I'd like to bring in one other element of Brownback as being on the ballot or not on the ballot, and that's the judges.
Yes.
Because I don't think there's any question that as the night wore on, I was paying particular attention to the judges, that you did see across the state, I think Brownback or the judges had more strength consistently across the state than I thought they were going to have. And I do think that it was tied, this was going to give two things. One was education. And the second was you're going to give Brownback at 22% the chance to nominate potentially 4 or 5 judges. And I think that was a powerful argument. Not so much ideology, but do we want to put that power in a guy's hands who hasn't done that well?
Jeff, you wanted to say something, we'll go ahead. John, did you want to add
Well,
something?
I was going to say, the one thing that really surprised me about the Supreme Court retention elections was that they narrowly carried and said all of them, and the 4 who were kind of targeted for removal, they carried in Sedgwick County, which, given the death penalty case there, the Carr brothers, was really an interesting result. And that, to me, was interesting, that you had these folks being retained, albeit by significantly smaller margins than they have been in the past. And the Kansans for Fair Courts really made that argument about Brownback in their ads, and you could tell that it was having an impact because Brownback was distancing himself from the effort. Explicitly, you had a lot of discussions. Well, if these folks are ousted, there's this nominating commission that will pick 3 people, and Brownback even suggested it at one point. Well, the governor doesn't have to appoint the person. That, by the way, has never happened. They've always picked one of the 3. And the Kansans for Justice person who was the main, Amy James, talked about how they weren't ideological at all in the sense of a partisan ideology, and even really didn't like Brownback and thought he was a hurdle they had to get over. So that was a very interesting dynamic.
And I saw you nod your head.
Well,
What role do you think the judge questions motivated people to go to the polls? Do you think there was a linkage between that and, in the general, between that and the decisions made higher up in the ballot, in the state ballot?
I don't know if that issue alone would have motivated that too many voters, but I think that
It's kind of a separate question for a lot of voters.
It was kind of a separate question, but I mean, if you're looking for, in my opinion, a clear repudiation of Brownback, that's where it was in this election, because that was his issue. I mean, that was a direct, I think it was driven, the vote on that was driven largely by the idea that that would give him an opportunity to appoint at least 4 justices.
Do you agree with that, Patrick? Do you think the judge thing was a motivator, or was the real referendum on Sam Brownback? I ask that because we're going to turn in a minute to what's going to happen in the 2017 session, and understanding what the voters were trying to say seems like an important calculus in that. So
Sure, and I think a good way to think about this election was that this was Sam Brownback's midterm, just like 2014 was Barack Obama's midterm. And to put Kansas in context, even when you have a presidential election going on, if a governor is very popular or unpopular, the state elections often turn on their popularity. So what we saw here with Democrats gaining, even though Donald Trump won the state, is not unusual in the spectrum of elections. And if you look at where Democrats gained, they largely gained in, Republicans went into this election with 9 state Senate seats that Paul Davis had won, 25 state House seats they were defending that he had won. Their losses were mostly concentrated in those seats, with a few exceptions. So areas where the governor had already been rejected at the midterm, where, maybe regardless of whatever people were going to do, if they were on the more conservative side, they were going to lose. But I think some people were able to effectively distance themselves. Some of the Johnson County moderates, Tom Sloan here in Lawrence, certainly were able to hold on in districts, more moderate to liberal Republicans were able to win in districts that Paul Davis and Hillary Clinton won in landslides. So you can effectively distance yourself, but I think in certain places where Democrats had the right candidate in the right district, it certainly was about him.
Bob, let me get you in, if I could, real quick. Can we take a lesson from the results in Kansas, again, before we turn to what's coming in the legislature, in terms of for lack of a better term, the rubber band bouncing back a little bit from a more conservative approach? And I mention that because we're concentrating, of course, on state legislative races and the judges, but Tim Huelskamp lost in the primary too, one of the more conservative members of the House. And you do get a sense that Kansas, unlike a lot of other states, the rubber band has snapped back a little bit to a more centrist approach, which I think there's a sort of, I would assume, agreement on this panel. So is there a lesson in that more broadly for the rest of the country, that nothing is permanent in politics, that the voters sort of change their minds every 2 years? Or is this uniquely because of Sam Brownback, uniquely because of the LLC exemption, uniquely because of the budget deficit, that type of thing?
No, the answer is yes. There's a lesson here, and some people who lose elections, it's very frustrating, of course. But because when other people say patience or get back to work, you're upset. But the Kansas example is, any of us who are little of a certain age know that Kansas has been a moderate to right state. And Sam Brownback and the legislature he brought in was unusual, unprecedented for Brownback. And he's not unapologetic, very, very, very conservative governor. The Kansas had not elected those types of governors before. And
Let's be fair to Sam a little bit. He didn't try to hide that.
That's what he said, unapologetically. His first
right.
state of the state was, we're going to lead the nation. But what was interesting,
and he was elected twice.
Yeah,
on
what
that
was
message,
interesting
no
was he would often say, or others would say, well, Kansas is a center-right state, but how they governed was largely right, 90% right. The center disappeared, and he went after the center in the Senate primaries after 2 years, which was also unprecedented. Clay said, I don't get involved in primaries, and then I thought, well, some people do. And that was unbelievable to people who'd watched Kansas politics before, targeting members of your own party in a politically, not physically, but politically
Why did that not happen
vicious,
in this primary? I think we all waited for
vicious way. But
I think we were all waiting for the August primary this year to be a repeat of those other examples of the chamber and others getting involved, and it didn't seem to happen. Maybe we just weren't paying attention. I wasn't, maybe. Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Well, I think they did.
Yeah.
I just think it wasn't as effective.
Why?
Because they tried the same thing they tried before, which was, here's a scary picture of Barack Obama and your legislator, and that had worn thin because they used it for 4 years. And it wasn't nearly as scary as this consolidation of power that Brownback had assembled. That's why I think it wasn't as effective.
John, you wanted to weigh
I
in
was
on
just
that.
going to say Huelskamp is a special case, and it was, and there was a lot of afterward, particularly even in national media, about what it meant and the larger trends. What it came down to was, boy, I don't know that there's a really nice way to put it. There was a perception among some voters that he lost that U.S. House agriculture seat, and that led some voters to believe he was, for lack of a better word, a jerk. And I will say that there were a lot of conservative voters that I talked to who liked that kind of feisty personality and didn't see him as being that way, but saw him as being, the principal fighter. So we should say that. But it mainly came down to how voters viewed his personality. So
One of the great challenges is always understanding whether it's the particular of a candidate in a race
And
and
in
whether
his
there's
case,
a
it
broader
probably-
thing. Right.
but-
Go ahead,
but I
Burdett,
do
and then we'll
think,
come over here.
well, if we want to talk about the rubber band, it's in the state legislative primaries and the general election. I think you saw it bouncing back toward the middle. Here, you were way out on the right, and Roger Marshall is he's quite a conservative Republican candidate, and it was coming back to where I think the first district has historically been.
Right, but there's a sense that if you didn't have that battle with leadership, U.S.
Oh,
House
absolutely.
leadership, you didn't have these groups, you might not have had these groups coming in. I remember several Tea Party congressmen, Steve King from Iowa, coming in to help Huell's Camp at the last moment to make the case for his record.
You really had, on the other side, you had the Farm Bureau, you had major groups coming in on Marshall's behalf. And so there really was a struggle.
I guess what I'm arguing is that in Kansas, the assumption, I think, until this year was, if you had an R by your name and you were an incumbent, you were a virtual shoo-in, even in a primary. And this didn't turn out to be the case this year, and maybe for the reasons John's talking about, but also because it shows that any candidate, any office holder who gets a little bit ahead of the curve can be brought back to that curve by the voters, and I think that's kind of what happened in Kansas this year.
Well, and what's interesting about the Huell's Camp race, of course, is then probably Trump was very popular out west. I mean, I kept hearing stories from Clay about how you couldn't keep the signs for Trump in the office because they flew out the door so quickly.
Once they arrived, right, Clay? I mean, it took a while to get them.
In Huell's Camp's defense, he kind of has that same kind of blunt, brash aura that Trump had in his presidential race, not going to worry about saying the politically correct thing, that sort of thing. So it's interesting to me in that environment that voters in the first district swung a little bit back toward the middle, although the middle here is relative and picked Marshall. But Marshall had a lot. He had the farm groups, he had the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, kind of these establishment Republican groups behind him. So.
Jeff, you wanted to say something, we'll go to Jason and then.
Well, and 2 points. One, on the Republican incumbents this election, I believe in 2012, more Republican incumbent legislators lost than in 2016.
Yeah.
So it's the safe nature, the perceived safe nature of Republican incumbency hasn't been at that level in at least 3 election cycles, maybe longer than that. But
would you agree, though, that that's the perception somehow? Maybe the perception is not what the reality is?
If it's the perception, I think it's an incorrect one.
It's just wrong.
And the second point I would note is there's no question that the legislature in 2017 is going to be more moderate than the legislature in 2016. And I think there's no question that the legislature of the last 4 years was to the right of the state to some degree. However, I would caution from taking that too far or thinking that the snap back is going too far left. If we look at Oklahoma, we look at Missouri, we look at Nebraska, those states for about a generation or even a little more have consistently moved further and further right. I mean, Oklahoma used to be a purple state in my lifetime, and it most certainly is not now. Kansas didn't have that evolution. If you look at the legislature of 2010 and the legislature of 2013, they're dramatically different. And so I would caution anyone that thinks we're moving back to the legislature of 2010 in Kansas, because I think the state has moved substantially right of what we saw in that
I want to come back to that, but Jason, you wanted to throw.
I just wanted to follow up on the Huell's Camp, and you were much nicer in your term on Huell's Camp than I would have been.
Well, I want to stress that was the perception of some voters. That's not
and
my...
not the Associated Press reporter.
Well, and to that point, in this last election and over Huell's Camp's last term, he there were a lot of reports of him being somewhat combative at some of these town hall meetings and some of these functions that he went to, having open arguments and somewhat vicious arguments with people that he was there to talk with. And I think the thing that cost him so badly on that was the Farm Bureau, which Roger Marshall worked for like crazy. I mean, he's been working that campaign for, since the last election, Marshall started working. And one of the first things he did was start lobbying the Farm Bureau. When the Farm Bureau threw their support behind Marshall, that pretty much sealed the deal, I think.
All right, let's turn our attention now to what's ahead. And Annie, let me go to you. You're a member of the legislature. Is it going to take 2 days or 3 days to solve all of these problems with all these changes?
I don't know how many digits to put behind those numbers.
What can we expect? What should the voters, let me ask it another way. Aren't the expectations of your constituents much higher than perhaps they should be based on the results in August and November?
I ran unopposed this last election, and I went to every forum that I could for the political candidates, so people had a chance to visit with me as well. And I have cautioned everybody that it's sort of like trying to avoid the iceberg when you're on the Titanic. We're going to have to turn the ship, but it's going to take a long time. That's a big, heavy ship, and the state is big and heavy, and we're in a lot of trouble. We can't fix everything overnight. We can't fix it's going to take decades to get us out of this hole. We are in deep, deep trouble. But I then go from being on the Titanic to being the tortoise and the hare. And I think we ought to be the hare. And I think we ought to be very careful and very upfront about what our people want us to change, which obviously will be the LLC to begin with. But let's be careful. We can't do it all at one time. And let's be careful and be very cautious and do sensible, progressive, moderate changes. And I think that's where the House will be.
Do you think, Ann, that that people are willing, voters are willing to be patient enough for that to happen? For example, I know we all talk about the LLC exemption, and for those who are not aware, of course, it's the zeroing of pass-through, state taxes on pass-through income. But you don't get the sense always that voters think that's the top priority. They think tax reform is a priority, and they think schools are a priority. And by the way, the judges in Topeka are going to hand down a ruling in a couple of weeks that could blow everything sky high. And so I'm just trying to get a sense of what you think voters are thinking as we all gather in January.
I think that voters understand that it's a complicated problem. And they know, anybody who remembers how long it took to write the current school finance formula realizes that putting that in front of the legislature and expecting them to do a new school finance formula, for instance, in 1 year is kind of, it's a big ship to move, as you say, in 1 year. One of the things that I think will be really interesting during this session is that the relationship between the governor and the legislature, because he's out there doing his budget right now and says he's talking to a lot of people about this budget, but none of them seem to be legislators, which doesn't seem like it bodes very well for the relationship they have.
But let's be clear, he's still an extraordinarily important player. I mean, I think another thing that everybody thought after November is, the legislature can fix this without Brownback, but clearly there's not a veto-proof majority in either house.
Right.
So
I mean, obviously they're going to have to work together, and that's true.
Can they do that?
That's true. I don't know. I mean, right after the election, I heard he was talking about, somebody was asking him, so how are you going to work with a more moderate legislature? And he said, oh, well, I've worked with a more moderate legislature before, and we've gotten a lot done. And one of the examples that he used was the LLC tax break. And Steve Morris would certainly tell you a different story about how the governor worked with them on that bill and on the tax bill, because according to Steve Morris, he was very deceitful about how that went forward. And so, I mean, I think that, I don't know, I just think that there's going to be some real challenges to trust and cooperation between.
Yeah. But again, let's be fair to the governor if we can. It isn't as if he doesn't want to solve these problems. He may have a different approach, Do you think there's some give and take possible between the new legislature and the incumbent going forward?
There will have to be.
Yeah. Do you think
But-
it's possible?
Oh, there'll be a lot of give and take. And, Sam Brownback, whether you like him or not, is one of the most successful politicians in Kansas history. 5 statewide victories. He's worked with different legislatures, and I think he's going to be open to different solutions. I think one of the outcomes of the race that's important is we put a lot of emphasis into the Senate in the last 3 weeks. So we felt that's what we needed to hold. It was sort of a die-in-place mission. And we only lost 1 seat. And I think the governor, if he vetoes something, there's enough people in the Senate, depends on the issue, that they would sustain that veto. So he's still a key player in that. I think another issue is the one level up with the new president coming in. He's already talking about, for instance, completely redoing Medicaid. So why would anybody try to do Medicaid expansion if you don't know what the new plan is? That's just another aspect that's going to make this confusing. And the last piece, I'll pass it off, is I noticed a lot of the Republicans, the newer ones that won in the primaries, tended to come in with a lot of promises. And then after they won the primary, they started having some cold talks with experienced legislators, mayors, school superintendents, and their vocabulary changed. Instead of spending more on this and this and this and this, it became responsible budgeting, these very generic comments. And this will take a few years to change. And I think a lot of them are now afraid they may get stuck with having to vote for a tax increase and budget cuts in the same session.
Right. Joan, you've been through that. And let's be clear, a third of the legislature will be new, freshmen. And they're going to be asked in their first votes, relatively first votes, for a massive, or could be asked, for a massive tax hike that, by the way, the governor will almost certainly veto. And so, the new legislature will be in a very difficult spot, it seems to me.
They are, and there are 2 big problems that they're going to have to fix. And whether they can fix them in this session or not, the expectation on the part of the public is, we've sent you there, fix the problem.
Because they all said as candidates, yeah, send me there and I'll fix the problem.
Right. So one of the things that they've got, if the tax bill that was changed in 2012 were still in place, they would have $900 million right now. I mean, the obvious easy fix, for which there are no votes, is to put the tax plan that was in place before they changed it back in place.
Right, and again, my argument is the governor will veto that almost certainly, and it won't solve the problem, and you're on record as voting for a $1 billion tax increase.
Absolutely, and that's what's wrong with that as a solution. But I'm saying that is the kind of magnitude of the problem. The second one that they've got is what the courts are going to do with respect to schools. And nobody knows, despite the fact that we all think we have a good handle on that, how much money is going to be required, if any, and how lenient the courts will be in determining whether or not we are unconstitutionally funding schools.
Yeah.
Because if we are, their remedy is you can't operate a school in an unconstitutional manner. And that's going to take a boatload of money.
Bert, is it possible that conservatives are secretly hoping the courts levy a huge amount so they can blame everything on unelected judges?
I think that's too clever by half.
Well, I'm a reporter, so
I'd go
I'm
back
a clever guy.
I'd go back to what Jeff said a little while ago about where the legislature is likely to be. Probably won't go back to the 2009-2010 legislature, which would be the last moderate conservative legislature, but it'll move back in that direction. I just did some numbers in the last couple of days. Of the 125 legislators who will be serving in Topeka, a grand total of 24 served in the 2009-2010 legislature, which was the last place where you really worked legislation. The last 6 years, with all due respect to the legislature, and particularly the last 4 years, it's been pretty much an ideological, here's what you're going to do it. Now,
or don't do it.
And now, with these immense problems, as you all point out, you're going to take a legislature that is filled with rookies or people who have not had great experience working legislation. And you're going to have to seriously work legislation in committees. You're going to have compromises between the chambers. You're going to have to work with the governor. None of those things have happened very much over the last 6 years.
Well, and let me just throw this in, because Jeff told us this at lunch. The Senate will, you go ahead, it was your point, about how many lawyers there will be in the Senate this year.
Well, the people that, when I would knock on doors that would say, I'm not going to vote for you because there are too many lawyers in the Senate, got their wish. Because Kansas will be the second state in the union that has a legislative chamber without a lawyer. In fact, the Senate Judiciary Committee will be led by a non-lawyer. We have a number of laws we have to change in the state because they require the participation of a Senate lawyer, which doesn't exist. So there certainly is going to be a gap in experience. But one thing I would add to that as well is the enormity of the hole that we face. If the simple campaign promises that I heard over and over of we're going to fund capers at the statutory level, we're going to fund T-Works or transportation plan at the statutory level, we're going to carry a $100 million ending balance, and we're going to pay what the Supreme Court says we should pay into schools. If we even use the assumption that they do the same thing that the court did in Montoy, which is actually a lower level given the current state of funding than many anticipate, we're talking about a $1.3 billion hole this year and a $1.55 billion hole in the following fiscal year.
In a general fund
In
that's
a general
about
fund that's $6 billion. And so, we're talking about things that are, honestly, it's a mathematical impossibility. You can raise taxes, cut spending. Even if there was a change in the income tax, people are sometimes miss the point that the legislature will be meeting in 2017. You can't raise an income tax retroactively. And so if the legislature in 2017 raises the income tax, which I don't know if they will do, but even on the LLC,
Would it take until 2018?
it wouldn't take till 2018, and you've got your budget problem before that. So the level of this whole, I told one of my colleagues that I appreciate the next legislature taking away the dubious distinction on my legislative record of having presided over the longest legislative session in history, because the next one's going to be longer.
If I could
Go
just
ahead.
add, I think, this is where the phrase comes in, is that elections have consequences. And you need to pay attention to the person that's knocking on your door, who's sending mail, talking to you, who wants to be your voice in the legislature. Because we told the people years ago, after the 2012 elections, we told the people that this hole was going to be coming. We knew it was going to happen. And the populace didn't listen clearly enough or didn't get the message clearly enough that this was clearly coming down the road. This is no surprise.
Yeah, and let me just, John Hanna, let me get you in here too. All of this problem, it will play out against the background of the 2018 elections in a way. The statewide elections, the governor is leaving office. I mean, so there will be that complicating factor as well, one assumes.
Well, and in addition to that, we're all waiting to see whether there are going to be some ripple effects from the presidential race. Does, for example, the Secretary of State, Chris Kobach, get an appointment, and then there's an opening there, and then there's somebody appointed to that job by the governor and another opening, and so on. You have the issue of Mike Pompeo's seat. He's been nominated as CIA director. I saw a Republican blogger comment that anybody who's driven within 10 miles of Wichita in the last year and is a registered Republican is on the list. And that's actually probably not far from the truth. My favorite part of her blog was that she was suggesting that Huelskamp could make a comeback because you don't have to live in the district to represent it in Congress. You just have to be a resident of the state. We'll see. I mean, we'll see how that plays out. That'll be pretty interesting.
But doesn't politics
Yeah.
really complicate the picture next year?
It does. I mean, you have people who are, every time you have statewide elections, you not only have people who are looking at the governor's race and who to support, whether they actually want to run for governor themselves, but you have, have these other statewide offices that people may or may not be interested in, depending on whether for example, if Ron Estes goes for the 4th District seat, then you'll have an appointed state treasurer. That person will be relatively new. That's an opportunity for a primary challenge, stuff like that. So you'll have all of that going on and swirling around and complicating. I do want to emphasize Jeff's point, though, because when I was listening to the rhetoric and talking to voters and candidates in October, I'm not sure they understood at all that all of these folks who were ticking through this litany of goals were in effect promising $1 billion a year tax increase. Nobody was going around saying, I'm going to raise your taxes $1 billion a year to do all this. But
clearly people expect more money for schools, without question. By 6 months from now, if there's not more money.
The interesting to me, when we talk about the income tax, changing it and not being able to move quickly enough to raise money quickly. What raises money quickly? Property and sales. Proper sales and other excise taxes.
Although
cigarettes.
The sales tax is really.
Well, and we've now got the highest sales tax on food in the nation, I believe,
Mm-hmm.
and our rate is probably our overall rate. Sales tax is up there. It's within the top third at
One
least.
of the just as an aside.
So is that politically possible?
Everybody in this room I know reads the Kansas City Star, and if you don't, I invite you to my column today because I talked a little bit about Joan Finney, who about 25 years ago suggested broadening the sales tax.
Boy, do I remember that.
Yes, and of course it was shot down immediately. But if you can't raise the rate, maybe broadening, loophole closing, Joan, some of those things.
I chaired the tax committee the year that she came in, and
During the Joan
I
Finney
held
time, yeah.
those hearings, and for 19 years tried to close those loopholes with the only effect that they got more, they got bigger, there were more of them. The only thing that is out there that holds any salvation, and I may get shot for saying this, the Kansas legislature in 92, when we passed the school finance formula, substituted one kind of money for another, and we imposed a statewide mill levy.
Right.
And we imposed it at 35 mills at that time, because that was roughly the amount that would bring in the amount of money that we needed so that we could lower some other taxes. And in its infinite wisdom, a few years later, the legislature started dropping that mill levy down. Then they began exempting homesteads off of it. The only realistic way, if the court puts a gun to their head, to get enough money to fund schools is going to be to look at that statewide mill levy.
Yeah, property tax, John,
Well, I was going to say, people talk about eliminating sales tax exemptions, but where's the money?
It's not possible.
It's the exemption that churches and other churches have. That's a big
No,
one.
but I'm talking about
utility bills.
But I'm talking about
services.
and wrote about services like architecture and engineers.
Well,
and
do you want to
others.
pay 6% more for legal services or architectural
Right.
or
And
or
I'm
whatever?
not arguing
those
for
are
a tax
all-
on services,
Th-
believe
that-
me.
that- that
But
they-
what I'm saying, John, is you got to go somewhere
Yeah,
if
you
you're going to
gotta-
get
well-
more money. That's just
Well, let
yeah.
me put on my conservative Republican hat here for a moment, and what I hear from conservatives. There are conservatives who wanted to do tax cuts because they wanted government to get smaller and more efficient. And so there are some of them out there saying, well, you gave us the lower taxes, now where's the smaller, more efficient government? And there's a pretty good argument that government can't get quite that small and efficient, but that is probably going to be part of this debate too.
Yeah.
I mean, they have some efficiency studies out there, and I think anytime you're looking at a really big, talking about raising a lot of new revenue, I think there's also going to be an attendant discussion about what government is doing, whether it needs to be doing that function, and actually Brownback in some ways initially tried to raise some of those questions around the edges, public broadcasting, the Arts Commission, that.
But there's not a lot of money there either,
No, but
is there,
the
Jason?
point is, those
ahead.
things are there.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that what it seems to me like we've seen, though, is that you've done away with revenue and that in the name of smaller government, but then neither the governor nor the legislature is willing.
Or social
So,
services.
yeah, so, I mean, it's kind of magical thinking, though, at this point, so.
Yeah, so some of your social
go ahead,
services.
Jason.
It was the adrenaline and sunshine that we were supposed to get here in the state.
Right, but let's also be clear, the governor, and the legislature passed the largest tax increase in state history in 2015, and it still wasn't enough. I think to your point, John, you're right, all of it is incremental, and the cuts would be incremental, but the hole seems so deep and so self-perpetuating in a way that the solution has to be something
Yeah, but if.
long-term and close to
I think
radical to get it done.
I think we need to make this point. The hole is big, it's serious, it's a major problem, and it did follow these tax cuts. But we also, at the same time, do have a genuine slump in energy production and agriculture. And if those things get better, and I think I saw something about the OPEC ministers finally ending their squabbling, and not that I look forward to paying more at the pump, but if oil prices start to rise, for example, some of this budget problem could get a little better. That would help.
Pretty amazing to think that Sam Brownback is cheering for OPEC today.
Well, one of the things I think really affected Brownback and the elections before, too, is this tax cut was not conservative in the truest sense of being conservative. Conservative is not doing something reckless in which a drop in agriculture and oil production can affect your income. Conservative is saying, hey, we have some money, we have a revenue stream, let's keep it, let's hold it back. Conservative is what Steve Morris did with the oil and gas depletion fund out in western Kansas. That's conservative, knowing that as that drops down and you lose revenue, you're going to have some to fall back onto. That's one of the things I think drove some of the things here.
And again, Jeff King, this is why understanding what the voters are saying is so important, because you didn't get the sense voters want smaller government. You get the sense that they want more money for schools, not less. They want more money for roads, not less. They want the pension funded as well as it can be funded. Maybe some even want Medicaid expansion, as was brought up here earlier. So that's why it's so important for the lawmakers to understand what voters were in this year.
I think as a foundation point, it's important to understand there's not a unitary voter. The voters in my district in rural southeast Kansas are not the Johnson County voters. They're not the western Kansas voters. They're not the Sedgwick County voters. In my district, it was this simple. We lost 2,300 jobs in a county of 34,000 people. My Senate district dropped 5.2% of its population since the last census, 5.2% in 5 years. I live in the largest self-contained town in a 5-state area without a hospital. That's what people are worried about where I'm from. They're not worried about whether government's big or small. They want government that's stable. They want jobs. They want to be able to put food on the table. And when my 88-year-old father has his 4th heart attack, they want a hospital to take him to. And so, yeah, you had a very conservative district that was overwhelmingly in favor of Medicaid expansion. Made sense. We didn't have a hospital, and we may not have a few more. In Johnson County, that's not nearly as much of an issue as I think the school funding is that we saw drive that engine. So I don't think there was a push for large government. I think there was a push for stable government.
Right. And Bob Beatty, the split between rural and urban interests is such an important part of understanding Kansas politics.
Yeah, and Jeff's point is fascinating, and I had the wonderful pleasure of being with Donald Trump in April of 2015 for one of his first appearances in Iowa, and where he started getting very quickly a large amount of support from all types of different people, was saying, you know what, our leaders are stupid. And I don't talk this way, by the way, but he did. And he was talking about Obama, but also Republicans. And to your point, he said they didn't have any common sense and they're making stupid decisions, and people started, that was really appealing. And I'm not going to say it, but when you look at the last 6 years in Kansas, yeah, many conservative Republicans are like, beyond, in the first district with Heels Camp, you know, why would we turn down money that could help our hospitals thrive? You know, yes, it may not be a conservative position, but why are we going to put at risk, you know, the entire state budget for an experiment? And these things piled up.
Well, and let me just add quickly, in the first district, and in most of Kansas, the link between the federal government spending on agriculture is extraordinarily clear to
why
most
would we
of the
want
people.
our congressman to be not on the agricultural committee? All these
Right.
questions, why it's, if Trump came to Kansas, he'd say, and I'm not Bob Beatty, but Trump, I have no question, would come in here and say, your leaders are stupid. They're doing dumb things. Do you agree with them? And the polls are showing no, 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 no. But to go to your point, the voters kept, you know, saying, well, they say they're going to work, and they're going to work out. I'm sure they'll work. Even your excellent point of, I got in a discussion at the Republican convention with Ron Estes, we're discussing this, and even if the tax cuts worked, normally in Kansas, you have a policy that isn't dependent on, well, everything else has to be great, and it'll work. So yes, even if jobs have improved because of the tax cuts, but it can't survive a downfall in energy. The years of tax policy in Kansas was built to withstand one segment having some trouble.
Yeah.
Right?
Again,
So-
I'm trying to be as fair as I can to Sam Brownback. He would claim they have worked, and he has claimed
That's what I
that.
mean. You can claim the tax
because
cuts.
unemployment is at its lowest level ever. More Kansans are
But
working.
what
than
a
ever.
Trumpian type person would say, it's dumb to put in a policy that that may work, but then can't withstand any other
The
chinks
bumps.
in the armor.
Clay, did you want to throw something in there?
Well, 2 points. One is, and I think the governor would say, well, the plan we ended up with was not the plan he wanted. He had a more balanced plan of lowering rates but getting rid of some deductions and credits, but it was the best they could do, so he signed it. Now, he signed it, he admits that, he owns it, but it wasn't exactly his plan. It was sort of a horse designed by a committee. He looks like a camel. And the second point is we took some polling in Johnson County, and 70% of the voters said they felt the solution to our current problems was cut government and raise taxes. But they voted for candidates that only wanted to spend more money. So they weren't voting their issues, which is why I think a lot of the kickback in this election was people who were uncomfortable with the status quo. Maybe they were conservatives that said, hey, we're conservatives, we're supposed to be for fiscal responsibility and not be living on the edge of whether we have enough revenue every month.
And Patrick Miller, how does a legislator take any lesson from that into Topeka in January?
Well, I mean, I agree with what the senator said, that certainly people want government that works, but I think at some level we're trying to make the voter more ideological than they actually are. The question you ask in a survey, everybody wants taxes cut. Everybody wants government to spend less. At the same time as if you survey them, they all want government to spend more on practically everything, including conservative Republicans in Kansas and national surveys. These are attitudes that kind of reflect gut sensibilities that have practically no meaning for how they actually vote or how they hold legislators accountable unless their hospital is closed or, the sales tax rate has gone up. In Kansas and nationally, if I survey most people, 25 to 40% oftentimes can't even label themselves ideologically. They don't understand what it means. So thinking like this is a conservative tax cut or a moderate tax cut really is not something your average voter is going to grasp. I think going forward, if government can work again, no matter how it's going to work with a conservative or moderate or liberal solution, that will make them happy. Yeah. But I would say looking forward, if Kansas is like other states, again, if this was Sam Brownback's midterm, Sam Brownback is probably symbolically on the ballot again in 2018, just like a president is often on the ballot when they're termed out, or a governor often is in other states.
Yeah. And if that's right, John Hanna, the dynamics change even more in the 2017 session because legislators will have a decision to make. Which side are you on?
Yeah, which side are you on? Obviously we heard about Obama's third term. And, to be fair, Obama talked about George W. Bush's third term. And so I'm sure we'll hear some rhetoric about Sam Brownback's third term as we get going. And that will be a fun dynamic. How much, to use a blues term, how much mojo is Brownback going to keep it as a lame duck? He clearly has the office. He has the veto power. So those are significant assets. The other issue is if the economy starts to improve, do those poll ratings that we've seen in the 20s start to creep up a little bit?
Right.
I don't know.
And do the coffers start to fill up a little bit? which
Well,
is a possibility.
the hole is so big that it's going to take a while for the coffers to fill up enough. I mean, but it is, part of that deficit, shortfall that we see projected is based on these latest revenue estimates, which, for I think the fourth or fifth consecutive time they went in and really slashed
We get a new estimate tomorrow. isn't
we
that right?
get actuals for November, and if the past 3 or 4 years are any guide, the state should hit its monthly target
In November.
for November. But if they're just on, or $15 or $16 million more, let's say, that says something different with each of those.
We're
But
going to take questions here in just a few minutes,
okay.
but Bert, I want to ask you this, and then whatever.
Okay.
You've been in the governor's office with a Democratic governor. If you were in the office with Sam Brownback now, what would you advise him? What should he do?
Boy, that's an easy question.
Well,
Careful.
I mean, I would say engage. I would say engage. You have to engage, and you have to, at some point, become a little more reality-based.
Does he need to be more candid with the public?
Oh, I would say so. But
I mean, this whole idea of expectations, I think, is
this
so important.
But this is where I wanted to go a second ago, is that we're focusing here on the revenue side so much. But look at the policies. Just canceled 24 highway projects. CanCare is in desperate shape.
Mental health is a problem.
Mental
It sounds
health,
like.
the elderly, you go on. So when you talk about revenue, it sounds like something that's antiseptic. Well,
Yeah, it's not.
we're really talking about, and I think here is where a lot of people, the rubber meets road for for people who have someone elderly who can't get services, whose hospital closed or might close. And so we were all waiting, I think, to say, what were the implications of this? Well, the implications are coming home time and time again. It's not so sexy. It's hard to report on sometimes. But I think it's there.
Yeah. Let's, one more question, and then I think we will be ready for questions from the audience. Jason, what would you advise the governor? What do you think? I think, again, it seems to me as if framing expectations would be so critical in the first couple of weeks of the session to say, look, I've written this column. I've often said, and I still think this is true today, that if Governor Brownback simply came out and said, gosh, I'm sorry it didn't work as we expected, we need to figure out a way to get back, the people of Kansas would forgive him like that. And his popularity would double overnight because they would see some sense that he understands what's happening. I just think that's a real challenge for him in the first couple.
Well, I think I would like to see the governor be honest. I mean, it's one thing to say, I tried this radical thing, and then just keep plowing ahead, even though all the evidence is mounting that it was wrong, that it's not working, that it's harming people's lives. I don't see what come out and say, we tried it, it didn't work. The reason he won't do that is because it's a cornerstone of conservative economic ideology. You won't ever say that kind of tax cut doesn't work.
But Clay, what does Governor Brownback have left to prove, really? I mean, it doesn't, one assumes that his career more or less will come to an end, assuming he doesn't go off to Washington, but he serves the 2 years. Either he joins the administration, but his elective career seems at an end. Does he have anything left to prove? Would that help him be more candid? Does he need to be more candid? Or do you think his rhetoric has been good?
I think a general criticism, Governor, and the entire Republican effort is they haven't done a great job of telling their story. Here's what we're trying to do, here's our vision, here's why we're doing it. And understanding that anytime you move forward in a different direction, you're not always sure what's going to happen, you have to adjust as you go. I always found it funny that people got so excited when he used the word experiment because everyone from Franklin Roosevelt to Alf Landon, other people have used that term frequently, just saying anytime you go off and try something new in politics, it is an experiment. And you have to see what works and adjust and work with the legislature. And I think the next 2 years, he's pretty much achieved all his policy goals that he set out in 2010 when he was running. And now he just has to work to fine-tune them and work with the legislature to fix what he can.
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and take some questions from the audience. Just raise your hand, and I think we have some microphones that'll go around. And just address your question to any of the panelists you'd like, and we'll get a good discussion going with the audience. Yes, sir.
Many Kansans are familiar with the water issues facing the state. Depletion of the High Plains Ogallala Aquifer in the western part of the state, and the loss of water storage for municipalities and flood control capacity of our reservoirs in the eastern part of the state. How do you see these issues, which will require long-term stable funding, how do these issues play out in the 2017
Joan,
Kansas legislature?
maybe Joan, you could pick that up a little bit. And it's about water policy, obviously, and the governor has worked on water policy a little bit.
And to his credit, water is one of those issues in Kansas that still remains to be resolved, but I'm not sure that he has resolved it either. And if you talk to some folks out in western Kansas, the hard lifting there still has to be done. Your question was, though, how do we resolve moving forward in the financial crunch we're in, right? And
yes.
I think that based on my own experience in the legislature and working with it, I think everything's going to stall until they resolve some of the funding issues and the budget issues. And the biggest one is the governor's refusal at this point to take any kind of executive action to begin to start that process for bringing the budget in line. And that just pushes it further down the road and makes the hill to climb much, much greater. I think the challenge and the task is so large that very little will go on. If you look at just what happened in the past 2 legislative sessions in terms of the numbers of bills they were able to pass, it's dropped dramatically because the big issues have pretty much pushed everything aside.
I think we can all agree that for the first month, we'll be talking about abortion and guns before they get to this stuff, which they do every year, of course. Jeff, did you have something you wanted to?
I was just going to make the point on the eastern part of the state. What happens with our reservoirs is going to be largely dependent on the success of the dredging effort at Redmond. Right now, because John Redmond Reservoir, which is the most silted reservoir in the entire state, is the water cooling source for Wolf Creek, we're able to access funding from the utilities to engage in a dredging project there that is unprecedented in scale, certainly in this state, but pretty rare nationwide. If that effort proves economical, there's a long-term strategy of looking. Elk City Reservoir is the second most silted reservoir in the state, which is literally in my backyard. We're looking at whether dredging that is more economical than constructing an entirely new reservoir. And those are decisions that are probably about a decade from being made, so hopefully we're talking about a different fiscal situation.
Right, and Jason, you wanted to weigh in quickly because obviously in south central Kansas, water and city water supplies are an issue.
Well, particularly in western Kansas.
Right.
The Hutch News covers a lot of western Kansas, and I think the feeling out there, aside from the budget and everything, this is one area that I think people feel Brownback has shown a lot of leadership in. That's a pretty bold stand to go out to western Kansas and tell farmers to quit irrigating and to try to talk to them about how they have to make this a sustainable resource. And to that end, he and his staff has put together some really sound policy, and people out west it's given them kind of what they needed to experiment. They used to have, and I can't remember the specifics of this, but use it or lose it. You had to irrigate no matter what, even if it was a rainy year. They kind of got rid of that. People aren't being penalized for that. They won't lose their water rights. That's a really bold thing to do and something that should have been done long ago. So in this area,
Hanna, you wanted to weigh in.
Well, I'm the ranking Democrat on energy environment, so I would love to say that I could really answer your question well, but so far the speaker has never seemed in the House to see the reasonable for us to be debating water issues that always is in agriculture.
Do you think that will change in 2017? I mean, Ray Merrick is gone, so.
I will be in the office asking for that to happen, because I sort of look at the fox guarding the hen house if it's always in ag. Having environment look at it as well, I think, will be crucial and a responsible thing to do, to have other people looking at the issue.
And broadly, do you think Merrick's departure will play a role in your ability to reach agreement in Ray Merrick's departure? I mean, we've talked so much about...
Ray didn't turn me out of the office. Right. I could go in and ask him and talk to him about anything.
I guess what I'm
wanted
asking
to.
is, we've talked so much about Sam Brownback. The question is really whether the leadership changes, which will be decided next week, might play a role in sort of breaking the log jam.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think on the Senate side, they'll be more indicative of where the chamber is than of the leadership itself making a huge change. So we'll have a lot more of idea of how the pieces in the Senate fall after we see how a leadership
A lot of
election
2020 votes, maybe. Yes, in the back?
It's been rumored that Brownback will be offered the job of Secretary of Agriculture. Do you think he would take it and just breathe a giant sigh of relief and get the hell out of Kansas?
Can I, just before I toss that to the panel, I invite you to read your Kansas City Star in the next couple days, because I'm writing a story a little bit about what the impact of a Brownback departure would have on the things we've talked about here today, which I think is interesting. John? Hanna.
Well, the short answer is yes. If he were offered Secretary of Agriculture, I think the sense is he would take it. He's not commenting. It wouldn't yesterday. There's also been some discussion of whether he might be an ambassador. The one I hear the most is the Vatican, but I've also,
Sudan.
I've heard a couple of trouble spots. So yeah, I think if you get a good offer and you have a chance to make an impact on the federal level, yeah, you take it. And I'm reminded of, and I know Jeff was here and Annie was here. I'm reminded of 2009, and there was a lot of discussion about Kathleen Sebelius, two-term Democratic governor, going to Washington to be HHS secretary. At the time, the legislature, and she and the legislature were mired in this huge battle, a multi-year battle over whether a coal plant would be built. Two coal plants, actually, in Holcomb, and her KDHE turned down the permit, and here it is, 2009, and we're looking at a third consecutive year of that legislative battle. And Mark Parkinson becomes governor, and within 5 days, I think, it was certainly less than a week, he had an agreement with Sunflower that not only kind of in theory, obviously court battles followed, but in theory cleared the way for one coal plant and a lot of green energy legislation. And so
because I'm doing research for the story, the other thing that's forgotten is the legislature and Governor Parkinson reached agreement on a 1-cent sales tax increase for 3 years.
That actually, I think, was 2010, though.
Well, but he was governor. My point is, and in this story is, that sometimes a clean slate can be helpful.
Right, that's the point. It raises the question of whether a governor who's been in the trenches now for 6 or 7 years, you develop hurts and damaged relationships, and whether sometimes it can be helpful to have a new face in there. We don't know. I mean, obviously that's going to depend on the president-elect a little bit. But that's an interesting question. But yeah, I think if he gets a good opportunity, I think he would take it. I think also if Chris Kobach gets offered a good position, I can see him taking it. So we'll see.
Anyone else on that subject?
What about Clay? You would have something to say on that.
No, Clay, you're going to stay here until you die, right?
All I can add to
I
this,
say that because you've done an excellent job,
Thank you.
especially working with reporters.
Yes, indeed. I second that emotion.
I have no inside information on nominations. Someone on the Trump team told me that there are positions, I have no idea which ones, that if Governor Brownback wanted them, he could have them. And you'd have to talk to the governor. I'm sure part of him would like to move on to something bigger, but part of him feels a sense of duty. He brought in all these changes, and he needs to see them through. And I don't know what he decided. That's up to him. I just met him briefly this morning at the state canvass, and he was talking policy and legislative strategy.
Yeah. Another question? In the way in the back, and then we'll come up front.
Hi, there's been a lot of talk today about the generic Kansas voter and what kind of sense there hasn't been about that, but I appreciate that Senator King talked about how the Kansas voters are not monolithic. And given that the pressure that's put on the new representatives and senators, they're going to be responding to issues and pressures that aren't monolithic. And so I wonder what effect that will have on the policy things that get implemented.
And you want to take that, and then we'll go to Jeff. I ask you only because it's maybe our duty as writers to give the legislature a little space, maybe, understanding the challenges that they face, particularly opinion writers.
No, I think you're right about that. I think that it's easy to kind of paint with a broad brush about, well, Kansans want more money for schools. They, want fewer taxes and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, there are a lot of subtleties to that you have to take into consideration, which is why it becomes so complicated. You try to satisfy, one want, and then it affects something else that you don't want it to do. So, I mean, I think one of the things that I know that people have talked a lot about is this huge urban-rural split, which always kind of makes me cringe because I don't think, I mean, in general, there may be an urban mindset and a rural mindset in Kansas, but there certainly are a lot of exceptions to that. And I think that is why it makes it so complex to solve these problems.
There's a lot of moving parts.
Right.
And then Ann's not going to like my first comment, because I would say the most important labels for the 2017 session aren't conservative, moderate, and liberal, but rural, suburban, and urban, primarily because the issue of this session is going to be school finance reform in the wake of the Gannon decision especially. And if you look at when Kansas has drawn formulas before, the last school finance formula was the longest standing school finance formula in modern Kansas history. When we did the last one, and I'm with Annie and Joan here, I'm very aware that the person that wasn't there is talking about it around the people that were. That would not have gotten done if we didn't have substantial new money to put in the formula, and if there wasn't the ability monetarily to placate both the rural, suburban, and urban interests. That money isn't there. And those interests still exist, if they're not even more acute, after this session. So I think your point is very well made, that the voter in the Elk Falls that's worried about losing the school that has 180 students in it, that voter's mindset better really be in the mind of their senator, because that's going to require a very different solution than Johnson.
Well, Joan, let me say, Joan, what do you do first, Joan? What do you do, school finance, or you do revenue first?
You.
Joan, yeah.
Me.
Which do you do first if you were in the legislature?
You have to do them together. I was in the middle of that 92 thing, as were several people in the audience out there. I see Kent Glasscock and Sandy Prager. We were all fighting over that. And you have to do them together because the money is important and the education component of it, so that you're fitting within what the Constitution requires. And there's some very definite requirements. We hope that the courts will give more instruction about that than they have done in years past. But you have to have both of that, and you have to work it together, and you have to work it from the day one of the session until you can get it passed.
Nothing is settled until everything is settled,
No.
right, Annie?
Well, and I think it's important, early on in the legislative session, we are working in committees and not doing a lot of action on the floor, which then allows us to go home early on Fridays. And for people that are in rural communities, this is very important. You need to go back, use your weekends, and meet with the people that elected you. Listen to them and hear what they have to say. And that is important for wherever you live in the state of Kansas. But it's, again, you go back and listen to the people who sent you there and represent what they say and see what kind of compromises we can all get to. And as I agree with Joan, we're going to go from day one.
Yeah, we got a question over here and then maybe in the front.
So this being the Kansas panel, having the Kansas media here, you'll have an interesting perspective on your relationship with the national media. I heard a lot of you guys. So I worked on Dr. Marshall's campaign, so I heard a lot of you guys talk about in the state legislature how there was a difference between the issues voter and the establishment versus lack of establishment voter. And many of you, I know Dave, John, you guys talked about, definitely Jason, the fact that the Marshall-Huelskamp race was ag-based, trade-based. There was plenty of other stuff, but it fell on those issues, all agriculture. When the national media came in after that race, they talked about how it was PAC money versus the Tea Party. How did you guys, what was your relationship like with the national media? Because I know you guys talked with them and gave your take on it. How to focus them on that there are still races focused on issues that affect close to home.
John, you want to take that one?
Well, in the case of that race, for us, I was the national media. I was and the people in Kansas were the ones writing stories, and you do have to think about the larger trends and what it means. But I still, from my reporting, talking to voters, everybody. Yes, there were these larger forces at work, and there were opportunities, but it was a special case, and I think people viewing the race from further away wanted to read into it because we had a Republican congressman, an incumbent Republican congressman losing a primary, which frankly doesn't happen very often.
And in Kansas, that's what's
And in Kansas, in arguably maybe one of the 5 safest Republican districts in the country, there was some sense of wanting to read into it, especially because Huelskamp had become this kind of national spokesman in that for the Tea Party caucus or the Freedom Caucus or whatever name you gave it. I think part of it was one of the senses you had was that the Republicans who were unhappy with Huelskamp over the loss of the Agriculture Committee seat and some other issues finally found the right candidate. I'm trying to remember. I don't think Huelskamp had much of, if any, challenge in 2012 at all.
Allen Law Police.
And then Allen Law Police in 2014. And he went into that race, obviously an unknown. So there was that sense that finally the Republicans who were against Huelskamp found a candidate they could
Although the
coalesce
2014
around.
race was kind of the first time we had an idea that he might be vulnerable.
Well, I mean, anybody talking to voters in the district got the sense of some dissatisfaction, but, the issue was how much.
Yeah.
And then, the fact that Allen Law Police, who was, again, pretty unknown and didn't spend a lot of money, got within 10 points.
The Tea Party and the ag thing were inextricably linked together. And you couldn't take one away from the other because
he got kicked off ag because of the John Boehner.
Right, the penalty for being the rebel was to lose the ag
Boehner
committee
kicked him
seat.
off, and he knew what could hurt him.
Yeah, I would just say, Eric, and then Jason, maybe you want to weigh in. I just say quickly that in any race that you cover that rises to national attention, which can be often in Senate races, like the Orman Roberts race in 2014, a lot of national people came in, and even in the I'm getting the hook here, which I deserve actually, but the Roy Blunt race against Jason Kander in Missouri, there was some national attention, and you always have to weigh, as the reporters closest to it, whether there are unique circumstances that determine the dynamic of any race. The candidates' specific issues, ag committee membership, did Pat Roberts ever come home? Does that make a difference against national overlying trends, Tea Party revolution or midterms or whatever, and reach a balance? And we often reach a different understanding of that than the national guys who aren't really paying a lot of attention to it until the end.
Yeah, I always, this won't be good for any of my career aspirations, but I always kind of roll my eyes when the national media rolls into town because I feel like there's a narrative that they want to promote and they don't really spend a lot of time getting the real sense of people in the district. or a variety of voices in the district, and they come in, they're there for a week, they can write whatever they want, and then they can leave. I write something like that, my phone's blowing up, my email's blowing up, I gotta live with everyone that I've written about, and it happens. I mean, I have to defend myself when I do, but I have to stay in the community in which I'm writing about. So as a local journalist, community journalist, I'm there, so I have an understanding of what this part of the state's like. But when the Boston Globe or the New York Times rolls into town, I feel like they're just hitmen. I mean, they just come in, they write some hit piece, and then they roll out, and they leave me to pick up the damage because they're like, well, you're just as liberal as the New York Times.
I will say, you do get panicked emails in the last week. What can you tell me about candor, and from the Los Angeles Times. So go ahead, Patrick.
I just defend the national press slightly here, because I did 4 or 5 interviews, New York Times, Washington Post, a couple of outlets about the race. And, talking about the question you ask, and convincing them that there are actual cities in the first district and things that are not farms was difficult, number one, right? But they didn't want to write about that because they're thinking national audience. And for them, that race fit into this narrative of Speaker Paul Ryan's problems with the Freedom Caucus. It fit into the narrative of the National Chamber of Commerce actually directing a lot of money into Republican primaries, trying to off Tea Party members of the U.S. House in primaries. So it fit into that, and that's what their audience kind of nationally really wanted to hear about instead of, what's up with the agriculture seat for Kansas. And I think in those instances, it does fall on the Kansas press more to have more of that local angle and less about national.
Well, when you look at that first district, how unusual to have a Tim Huelskamp after Jerry Moran, who was accused of running and hiding, during votes. And then Huelskamp was out on so many national shows. He even liked to go on MSNBC, Huelskamp. And so he was consciously wanting to be a national figure in a district that was used to Jerry Moran. And I kept telling national reporters, this is just, something's out of whack here, and it's going to right itself. But we have an interesting situation in Kansas the last several years where we had Huelskamp, Brownback, and Kobach all in varying degrees wanting to be national figures. And again, Brownback in his State of the States would say, we're going to lead the nation. Nation, look at us. We're going to do this. Obviously Kobach, but Huelskamp too. And Huelskamp was sort of the first casualty of Kansans in one place saying, you know what, just take care of us here. We see you all over the national TV and stuff, and, we're not so happy. So it's been an interesting political phenomenon for the last 6 years.
I was going to say, because I have to deal with this issue on a fairly regular basis. I mean, as a reporter, you can't ignore those national trends. You can't pretend like there isn't an effort by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a desire to get rid of some Tea Party members. You can't... Or larger forces at work. That was pretty obvious, but also as the person kind of being closest on the ground, there are some things that, there were some local things. There were some things that were specific to Huelskamp. Huelskamp lost. Steve King and a couple of others who were challenged did not. So there was something that happened with Huelskamp that did not happen with those other guys. And that's what or women, and that's what you have to parse out as a reporter. And yeah.
I'll tell a brief version of the story and then one last question. In 2014, there was a lot of national interest in Roberts and Orman, and MSNBC would call me on occasion to do Rachel Maddow or whatever to talk about that race. And they'd have a producer call and talk to you ahead of time to so they would understand what your views were. And the first time a producer called, I explained what I thought was happening in Orman and Roberts, and she said, wait a minute, you don't cover Kansas, you're in Missouri. And I said, well, no, I'm in Kansas City, Missouri, and our paper covers politics in both states. And she said, well, that's not possible. You're obviously, she had obviously not looked at a map to understand. So finally I said, well, does the New York Times cover politics in New Jersey? And she paused for a moment and went, oh, now I get it. So I was on that night. One more question in the back.
Yes, I'm wondering whether the panel would be willing to muse, if only as a thought experiment, about the possibility that the key schema to understanding our political moment right now is not the traditional left-right rubber band snapping back, of which the American people, I think, have proven over our history that we are not extremists. We always tend towards a moderate. We also tend, I think, in terms of the outsider-insider, to be open to insiders as long as it's their meritocratic elite. But that really what we're facing right now is a bottom-top, a massive suspicion that the institutions that have held our country together since our founding are under suspicion, such as the Congress, very, very low believability, press, very low believability. So this may exclude the panelists that are formally tied to the bipartisan establishment, but feel free to weigh in. But is there a necessity now, being that both the most popular candidates of the Democrats and the Republicans, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, probably could have run successful campaigns as independents, and that would have gone towards what I would call the radical middle, the bottom to top middle. Is there a possibility for creating a nonpartisan or a transpartisan radical middle platform that could really pursue creative new visions that the American people might support?
Let's have the political scientists help us with that, and somebody's been reading David Brooks maybe, but Bob, we'll go with you first.
The quick answer, I do believe you're onto something, and I agree with you. In Kansas, we're talking about Kansas. I think, and I was in a really good mood driving here, and then I listened to Jeff, and the numbers started adding up, and now I'm a little depressed. But I think there is a huge vacuum in this state for leadership. And there was in the United States, too. You mentioned Bernie Sanders, you mentioned Donald Trump. And really just outspoken, plain talk, and just honesty. You mentioned honesty. And one thing about Governor Brownback, and again, even if he's correct every single time, is it's never his fault for 6 years. Never. Mm-hmm. And again, to your point, even when that's true, you're humble and you say, this isn't working for these reasons. But it's the press. Even at this Cleveland convention, he met with the delegates and said, it's still the press. They're not telling our story. It's the press. It's the energy sector. It's the ag sector. This is a nationwide phenomenon.
It's Obamacare.
It's Obama. He mentioned Obama 17 times in his last State of the State address. In a Kansas State of the State address. So to your point, I think, a transpartisan. In Kansas, that would be, the 3 Democrats plus everybody else. Okay, I'm joking.
And Joan Wagner.
Yeah, but no, I do think there's a huge leadership vacuum in this state, not always in the legislature, but from the top, looking for a transpartisan approach to a number of these issues in which, to your point, maybe sometimes conservatives agreeing with an issue that they may not normally do, but because it makes sense in a certain area. And I don't know where it's going to come from, and maybe it won't come from anywhere, but there's an opportunity in Kansas for somebody to make a real splash, to your point, whether it's an independent. I don't know if Orman was the right vehicle for that, but he did pretty well for what he tried to do. I think he showed there's the potential, but now in this sort of post-Brownback and the deficit problem, the reason I say that, too, is we got issues of quote-unquote law and order. Okay? In Topeka, just in the last week, we've seen criminals getting probation, one in today's paper who'd been arrested twice and put on probation. We're not paying our prison guards enough. We're having trouble getting police and paying state troopers. That's a vacuum for leadership, for someone to come in and say, these are bread and butter issues, non-ideological, and I think there's a room for some leadership out there in the political.
Patrick, you want to talk about that, and then Bert?
Oh boy, how to condense this into a short answer. At the national level, I don't think that there is, bluntly. I mean, at the national level, we are incredibly partisan. The voting in the presidential election and congressional elections was incredibly partisan. Yes, most Americans are relatively moderate, center left to center right, but we are far more partisan than we are ideological. And I don't think there's a great potential at the federal level for that, which is interesting. Ever since Watergate and Vietnam, we've had declining trust in all of our national institutions. 60, 70 years of polling, we have never trusted our institutions less. But yet we vest our trust in our parties because that's our team. I think there is a potential for it at the state level because of the uniqueness of I hate to use the term one-party states, right? So I like to compare Kansas to Massachusetts in that we're more Republican than we are conservative, just like Massachusetts is more Democratic than it is liberal. And in states that have these one-party histories, you get a lot of people in that party who, if this were Ohio or Virginia, probably wouldn't be in that party. So because you have like the moderate Republicans here, because you have the moderate conservative Democrats in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Hawaii, you have these opportunities for these seemingly bipartisan coalitions because you have those people who don't really belong oftentimes. Or in some states, they belong in the party that it was in the 1980s. And the polarization of the party has kind of left them behind. The JFK Democrats or the Ronald Reagan, Bob Dole Republicans in many ways. So I think you could have something like that in Kansas, not because necessarily there's some great mistrust of institutions, but because party and ideology doesn't really line up neatly here the way that it does necessarily at the federal level. I don't think that what you're envisioning for a great, grand, bipartisan coalition of radical change is happening anytime soon at the national level, nor would I overstate anything that came out of this election. I mean, most of the things that the media is talking about in terms of narratives of this election were single-digit changes in the electorate, oftentimes isolated in small states. This was not a huge change. It just added up that way. So I'm not.
It's going to be a huge change. Let's be clear on that.
Well, for voters, it was not a huge change. It's a huge change in terms of who's in office, but the electorate did not radically shift. So I'm not convinced there's this appetite that maybe you seem to think that there is for some kind of grand revolution of the center, perhaps.
I think that, I agree with the grand revolution of the center. We keep waiting for that. We're a two-party system, whether it's mostly one party like in a place like Kansas or competitive two-party across the country. The Democratic Party is kind of down, but American political parties are incredibly resilient institutions, and they will be back in one way or another. But I do think that the question, the way you've answered it, you two guys have answered it, opens up the possibility at both the national level and the state level that there are issues dealing with affordable health care, dealing with infrastructure that have been problematic because of partisanship. A Trump administration might move some of these things down the road because it's a little unconventional. I think in the state of Kansas, the dire problems that we have with revenue are going to have to force people to work hard. And in some ways, just like the U.S. Congress hasn't worked very well. It's worked terribly over the last 15 or 20 years. And it's gotten worse and worse. And in some ways, I do think that we look for executives to offer the solutions. And honestly, I think that so much of the work could be done at the legislative level if you're willing to work to provide some more resources, and which is, I think, crucial at both the national and the state level.
Well, I think you'll all agree with me. This has been an incredible panel here today. Let's give them all a round of applause. And I think we can all agree that you have been a remarkable audience to sit here patiently while we all bloviated for your entertainment. But again, the Dole Center is to be congratulated. Thanks for coming out. I'm sure if you have any questions, individual observations, these folks will stick around for a few minutes. Good afternoon.
Another hour or two. Kept thinking of things to say.
Well, actually, I have a friend. So many of them.